Well, meanwhile, the United States is going to deploy its ground forces to Poland amid ongoing tensions with Russia over Ukraine. Polish Defense Minister Tomasz Siemoniak says the deployment is part of a plan to expand NATO presence in Central and Eastern Europe in response to developments in Ukraine. Siemoniak made the comment a day after meeting his American counterpart Chuck Hagel in Washington. He says the decision has been made on a political level and that military experts are working out the details. According to the minister, the U.S. and Poland will also increase cooperation in air defense, special forces, cyber defense, and other areas. Let's speak to William Jones. He's with the Executive Intelligence Review, and he joins us via Skype from Washington. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV, Mr. Jones. Now, this beefing up of NATO forces, specifically closer and closer to Russia, how do you interpret that?
Very ominous. When you have that kind of a buildup of military forces effectively on the border of Russia, this causes a reaction among the Russians. They have, over the period of the last 20 years, seen NATO getting closer and closer. And the games that have been played in Ukraine have been extremely dangerous, trying to pull them into a cooperation with Europe, which would be exclusive of Russia, which effectively they were in the process of doing with the EU proposals, sent warning signals to Moscow. And Moscow reacted in its own defense with the measures that have been taken recently. Now there is an attempt to pull together a political solution involving all the parties, but at the same time, the U.S. has the sanctions already imposed on Russia for the Crimean debacle, and they also are threatening more sanctions. So it's a dual policy which isn't creating much trust anywhere. And the second thing is that they are holding Vladimir Putin responsible for events that may not be in his control. And it's hard to say whether the two parties, that is the parties on the Maidan and the parties who have occupied the buildings in eastern Ukraine, are in anybody's control except their own. And therefore, something has to happen from the inside to create some kind of stability within Ukraine itself so that this drawback can start occurring on both sides.
Well, speaking of a drawback, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the Secretary General of NATO, his tenure is about to expire, and we are going to see a new Secretary General take the realms of NATO. Do you see the policies of NATO changing by a change in face at the top brass?
Well, it's really hard to say. It depends on who the top brass is, but the directionality of where it's going is very unnerving. The statements by General Breedlove, of course, and others have led to a increased military presence in Eastern Europe. It seems like they're drawing the borders of the old Cold War pretty steadily, and they're pushing them further east. And the issue in Ukraine, of course, is not only the instability now, but whether or not they have some form of intention of bringing that country as well into some kind of a defensive alliance. If that is, and some people, of course, have said that openly, that they would like to do that, although officially this is not on the table at the moment. But the Russians fear that. And I think that is a tripwire. That is a tripwire to war if measures are taken which could effectively pull Ukraine out of all relations, all effective relationships with Russia, then I think that becomes close to a casus belli. So that what's happening now is extremely ominous. And unless there's a shift in policy, not only within NATO, but also by this present government in the United States and some of the European governments like Germany, which is very concerned about this, to try and de-escalate the whole situation, I think we are heading for a very dangerous period.
And very quickly, if you can, Mr. Jones, who will benefit then from any sort of war between NATO and Russia?
Well, that's a different question. I think what's happening is that you have people who see that we're in the worst financial crisis in history, and in one sense, when war occurs, they feel perhaps that there would be a distinct advantage in taking over what remains of the world economy. But for the world at large, a war today really is a nuclear war. But Russia and the United States and NATO, these are nuclear powers. If a war starts, even on a conventional or a skirmish level, this can quickly escalate to nuclear war, and then all humanity is at stake. So nobody benefits, but there are a lot of people who will push it anyhow, thinking that somehow they can win that war.
All right, that was William Jones with the Executive Intelligence Review joining us from Washington via Skype. It's always a pleasure having you with us here on Press TV, Mr. Jones.